Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya once again, and we have with us Dirk Hohndel, VP and Chief Open Source Officer at VMware. And this is a kind of special edition of our Dirk and Swap conversation on open source. It's 30 years of Linux. And Dirk, as I think we were talking last time or during some conversation, that I started my journalism career as an open source journalist when I met a lot of luminaries. Actually, Jim Zemlin I met back in 2005 in India. That changed my whole approach towards life. So Linux has also kind of played a very critical role in becoming or making who I am today. So I attribute a lot of those success to that. But if I ask you, if you look at these 30 years, you have been involved from the very early on. Anything interesting from the very early days that you still remember?
Well, so I am one of the guilty people who started before this was cool. I saw Linus's post to compose Minix in August of '91. Back then, I didn't have a 386. I only had a 286. I sent him an email and said, "Hey, does this work?" And he's like, "No, it doesn't work." So I ended up saving money. I was a student at the University of Würzburg and bought myself a 386 SX 16 megahertz processor. The machine had 2 megabytes with an M, 2 megabytes of memory. And so in November, I started with version 0.11 of Linux, which was the first one that actually was able to page. So the previous version didn't start on my machine because it didn't have enough memory for that. Linus had a 4 megabyte system back then. And so to me, this is, I had kind of a front row seat through the early days of all that. And I remember all of this just being about having fun and programming as a hobby and sharpening your skills and learning about how to collaborate with other people in the distance. Internet speeds back then were very different from today. You didn't have video calls. You had our university had a 64 kilobit link to the internet. And so everything was text-based and the whole method of communication was very different. The tools that we have today didn't exist. Everyone today uses, let's go to GitHub and create a pull request. None of that existed. And so you would send a patch to Linus. He would tell you that you were stupid and that this was all wrong, would rewrite it his own way and would add it to his precious kernel. Very, very different feel. But the thing that strikes me when I look back is that all of us were just scratching our own itch. We were trying to build something that we thought was interesting, that was fun to us. And I often actually disagreed with Linus. He really wanted to implement the POSIX standard. That was one of his core goals, was to look at the POSIX standard and say, this is what I want. And I always thought, come on, no one's going to use this. Let's make it fun. Let's make it ours. He didn't want that. But for the first at least couple of years, none of us thought that this would ever go anywhere, that this would ever be more than a project we do while in college and that it would be forgotten in a year or two. And so to me, looking back, that is always the biggest surprise. Here I am 30 years later, and I'm still involved in this, and Linus still runs it. It seems absolutely crazy to me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that now. But I'm still curious, what got you involved? What were you doing back in those days that you had to get involved with a new kernel, which was not going to be as promising and big as GNU?
So, yeah, right. No, so I was a sysadmin at the University of Würzburg in the Department of Computer Science. And budget at universities is always short. So I had a Wise green terminal to administrate the VAX, the Sun workstations, and a couple of others. And it was super frustrating because you couldn't multiplex. I couldn't use it the way I wanted. So I bought this 286, put Minix on it, which is why I joined CompOS Minix. And I was trying to use Minix and Kermit and Screen to be able to better do my job from my spot where I was sitting. And so to me, this was literally just a slightly better terminal emulator that I could use to administrate the Unix boxes. That's what I cared about. And so when I started and I bought my 386 and things didn't work the way I wanted, there was a bug with the file system. Back then we didn't have a login process. You just ended up in a root prompt, right? And there were things that didn't work for me. And then with every new patch that came from someone else, the first login was written. As I said, paging, virtual memory started to work. And I continued to find bugs. I continued to find things that didn't work on my system. Theodore So wrote the first code for switching virtual terminals so that you could have multiple virtual terminals. You didn't have to use Screen for that anymore. Or there was a predecessor of Screen. I think it wasn't called Screen back then. And so I was playing with that, and because of the very bad graphics card that I had, this didn't work for me. It was always, here's a new thing. Oh, this doesn't work. Let me see if I can fix this. And then I wanted a bigger hard drive. I found a super cheap deal on a Seagate ST01 SCSI controller, blast from the past, and a 50 megabyte hard drive. And turns out that didn't work. Linux didn't support that. And a student in San Diego named Drew Eckerts was working on that. And I was like, hey, I have one. Let's work together. But it's that same story over and over again. You see a new piece, it doesn't work. You have a new hardware component that doesn't work. You use something in a slightly different way and it doesn't work. And then you try to fix it. It was all about scratching my own itch. There was no vision for my future as a software developer. There was no vision of Linus had this joking signature line, Linus God Torvalds, world domination fast, which was a running joke for all of us because we all thought this would never go anywhere. We were just having fun. And so I got involved with X386, with the implementation of the X window system for PC Unix systems, which didn't work on Linux. And I helped port that, and I helped work on shared libraries for Linux and the GCC port and all kinds of weird stuff. And I really, for the first couple of years, anything that looked interesting, I would jump on and do this. I mean, like a hyperactive squirrel. I had no focus, this is the thing I'm going to do and I'm going to make a name for myself. No, I was just, doing stuff. And then X386 actually was the thing I got sucked into and started to do more work on and focus on for the next 6-7 years or so until I left that community in around, I want to say 2001, so 10 years later. But initially it was whatever didn't work, I was trying to work on it.
Now, there's so much to unpack there. One word that you used were that you did not have any vision. And I have to Linus also, and he says, it's not just the code that he also shares the vision. People bring their own vision to the kernel, to the community. He doesn't, spread his vision top-down approach there. So if I ask you, if you look back at the kernel and you said, that the Linus got Torvalds or world domination fast, actually most of these things have happened. Linux kind of dominates the world today. Everything literally runs on Linux. Whenever I talk to people, the question I don't ask is that, can you tell me what runs on Linux? It's actually easier to ask what doesn't run on Linux. So if I ask you, since you have been part of the community and you have been part of thick and thin, what are the things that work for Linux? Because first of all, it is very, very unorthodox, approach. Your folks are still maintaining it over the mailing list. Linus also created a lot of things to solve his own problem, which is like Git is a very good example. You are not controlled or managed by any foundation kind of thing, and we talk about diversity. Kernel is one of the most diverse. I talk to folks who are all around the globe. We talk about remote work culture. Because of pandemic, it has always been work from home. Everybody was working from home. So talk about a lot of things that work for Linux and a lot of things that Word should have learned from the community.
So one of the interesting things here is that almost all of the things that you just list really weren't there at the beginning. a lot of what we now look back at and say, oh, these are some of the key factors why Linux has been so successful. A lot of those are kind of trial and errors, things that we figured out, that Linus figured out over time, of how do you actually successfully run such a project. We were very much learning as we were doing. And a big part of this was the willingness to admit that you were wrong. And that's one of those, personal abilities to accept that you said, oh, let's do it this way. And then a year later or whenever you say, no, that's actually the wrong way to do it. Let's do it differently. So if you look at, for example, the initial model, when we finally released the kernel 1.0 in March of 94, one of the things that Linus came up with was this odd versus even releases, development releases versus stable releases, which we tried for quite a while, and which nearly killed Linux when I think it was 2.5, 2.6 that took forever. But we had this problem where at one point it took us 3 years to get the next kernel out, the next stable kernel out. And that was one of those learnings when we said, no, we need to switch to a time-based model, which we still have today, the 13-week cadence, roughly 12, 13-week cadence that we use today. And a lot of the things that we developed here are things that have changed over time. Initially, the vision was Linus's vision. He wanted to create a POSIX clone. And very quickly, other people came in and say, oh, I want to do this thing, I want to do that thing. And Linus realized that if he would impose his will on people, then it would always be just the thing that he was doing, versus giving people the space to do their thing and be inclusive and bring in more thoughts and more ideas. The other thing that you mentioned, that there is no foundation that controls Linux. Well, there is the Linux Foundation, which helps facilitate a lot of how Linux works. But we have been extremely successful. Linus has been extremely successful in avoiding any dominating corporate influence, but always, or not even corporate, any dominating outside influence, always having that independence from any entity that wanted to control it, and always bringing in people with diverging views and making it better for it. And so if you ask me what are the key factors for the success of Linux, well, I have been asked this question a lot over the last 25 plus years. And I always say, key was the 386, the Intel 386 processor, a processor that was affordable enough, fast enough, and capable enough to do something like this. It was certainly the internet, the ability to bring together people from all over the world to work on this together. And it was the availability of the GNU C compiler and the suite of tools around that, the user space that we didn't have to worry about. But the fourth thing that I would add to that list, looking back over all these years, has been this willingness to bring in new ideas, to bring in diverging ideas, and to really not exclude things just because Linus or some of his key lieutenants disagreed with an idea. There was always the openness to try new things, to add new things, to add more people, to add more use cases, to add really crazy ideas that we thought would never work. But if someone wants to work on them, great, let's include them in what we're doing. And this has created this insanely large community with thousands and thousands of people working together productively. And then over time, we helped build the tools to make that better. I keep saying we, and I shouldn't. Linus has helped build the tools that make this all better. I mean, obviously, the introduction of Git is one of the highlights here, but there are so many other small things that he and many of the key lieutenants, the key early contributors worked on to make it easier to deal with a patch flow. So the patchwork tool, for example, Quilt, a lot of these things were integrated into our workflows to make it easier to bring a lot of developers together. And that really is also the reason why there is so much focus on the ability to do everything remotely. If you work in a corporate context, at some point someone will say, oh, we need to have all these people in a room and they work together for this next deadline. And yeah, we've had some conferences where a lot of people came together. I remember in 1994, the Linux Congress in Karlsruhe, Germany, the first real Linux conference, spring of 94, where I don't remember, maybe 70 of us came together. And it felt like, oh, wow, all of the key developers are in this room. That felt great. But that was never part of the required process. All of the processes were always designed to just allow anybody to work from anywhere as long as they had access to email. And I think that is that inclusiveness, the infrastructure around us with the Intel 386, the internet and the GNU user space, and that willingness to make it super, super easy for anybody to be part of that. That really is what worked.
Do you remember, or do you want to point out some key events that happened in the history that also helped in popularity of Linux or adoption of Linux?
So, I mean, obviously the ones that I mentioned, again, without the internet, this wouldn't happen. I think if I look back at some of the inflection points that seem to change the trajectory, there was this investment from IBM in the early days to support symmetrical multiprocessing. Initially, Linux was a single-threaded thing. It ran on one CPU. And I want to say like 2 years in, and now I'm getting a little uncertain about my dates, 93-ish, I think is when this happened. The first work was done to support SMP systems. And IBM was a driving factor there. And then Digital Equipment Corporation, which was later bought by Compaq, which was later bought by HP, when they brought out the Alpha architecture, they were the first hardware manufacturer that went out and said, we would love to have Linux running on our platform. And so that's the moment when Linux suddenly became a multi-platform OS instead of just being about the Intel 386, which is where it started. So that's another major inflection point. We support multiprocessor, we support multiple architectures. And after that, a lot of things started happening where more and more vendors thought that this is a great way to introduce new hardware technologies. So that first couple of them pulled after them a long sequence of other technologies that were brought to Linux by their vendors, which brought in just a completely different set of developers into the community. But the other big inflection point that we often talk about is almost random. So when the community was growing, the first large conferences were happening, more and more people got interested, commercial use started up. But there was still a lot of skepticism. There was very, very aggressive anti-Linux rhetoric out of Microsoft, of course. Some of the commercial Unix vendors were trying to straddle the fence and on the one hand work on Linux because they saw an opportunity here, but also try to differentiate, well, for the serious stuff, there is our proprietary Unix OS, but for the other stuff, you could play with Linux. And then at a Linux World conference in San Francisco, or maybe in San Jose, in the Bay Area, Oracle made the announcement that they had ported the Oracle database to Linux and would make that available as a supported platform. And that seemed to be this seismic shift where suddenly, one of the most important enterprise application, the Oracle SQL database, was available as an application under Linux. So it would support Linux and Solaris and AIX. It changed the way a lot of people perceived Linux. And it changed really the trajectory of how companies suddenly viewed Linux as a viable option for things where, 6 months previously they would have said, well, it's fun to play with, but we can't run the core of our business on this. And by 1999, 2000, that suddenly seemed like a very reasonable thing to do. And that really changed our industry. That really was it's this one event that by itself wouldn't have changed anything, but that seemed like this inflection point after which people started talking about it differently.
Can you also kind of quickly talk a bit about that, how Linux kind of made companies comfortable with open source and don't have to worry about, I don't want to say the word free software, that, hey, the free stuff is bad stuff. No, they got comfortable because they can see a very powerful technology that they can use. They can collaborate on it, but they can also compete against the same players they compete with. So talk about how Linux kind of become a catalyst in adoption of open source. Today, everything runs on open source, and I think we should talk about the role of Linux there.
I think that's a very, very complex topic because the trajectory was very different for different companies, often for different teams within companies. And you have to look at the supplier side, so the hardware vendor side, the ISV side. You have to look at the customer side. And then another aspect that plays into this is in 2000, the OSDL was started as this corporate, the foundation level meeting point where the large companies felt that even under the scrutiny of not being viewed as anti-competitive, they could still collaborate on something, even in areas of the market where they actively were competing. So Linux was in many ways the facilitator, the reason why companies started looking at that. Companies started looking at the OSDL, later the Linux Foundation, and companies started looking at open source solutions to solve their problems. But I don't think it is fair to say that Linux really was the reason why they did it. It feels far more like the excuse. Because typically when you look at these companies, they already used a ton of open source. They just didn't conceptualize it as such. And they just didn't think about it as, oh, we're using open source components. That was just something that you did. That was just something that happened to make your developers' lives easier. And Linux was the one that was so visible that it would bubble up in the corporate hierarchy and people would make more conscious decisions about this. Yet it's really a multi-year, I would almost say a decade-long transition from the super early adopters who started in the late 90s. I mean, IBM with their famous billion-dollar bet and their painting on San Francisco streets, which got them in so much trouble. There are a lot of companies that tried very early on to find a way to make this work for them. And then you have this transition over pretty much a decade until 2008-9, when it started to become really hard for a company to say why they wouldn't do Linux. When Microsoft changed their language that they used and how they interacted with these developers. And so, yes, Linux was a key catalyst. I don't think Linux was the only catalyst. I wouldn't even say that Linux was the main reason for that. It was just one of the many parts to this puzzle.
I think the visibility of Linux and how, of course, as you mentioned, marketing, it did play some role at maybe with the visibility and marketing, and Linux Foundation, it played a very critical role too with that. So
I think one of the differentiating factors here is one that goes back to the license. Linux was certainly one of the key pieces, the key software pieces that made companies comfortable with the GPL. I think that when the Netscape server was discontinued and Apache became a household name with the Apache license and the Apache web server, a lot of companies would use that instead of proprietary web servers. Even companies that maybe weren't as comfortable running GPL software. And so there is this transition where many pieces play together, and this overall question of what is my corporate policy? You mentioned Microsoft being involved in open source fairly early. If you remember back to what they were doing, initially they created their own license, which actually wasn't an open source license. It was a shared source license where you could see the sources, but certain rights were withheld from you. You couldn't modify it. You couldn't build your own binaries. You couldn't run a version built from those sources. You still had to go back to Microsoft for the proprietary software. The sources were just for illustrative purposes. And we saw quite a few other similar models where companies were trying to figure out, how wet can we get our toe without really getting wet ourselves. And over time, this has changed. And today, none of the companies in this industry are truly open source hostile. We still have companies in this industry that are fairly GPL skeptical. Obviously not the place to blame some, but some of the largest players in this industry try very, very hard to focus on permissively licensed project only, to the point that some of them quite explicitly reject all GPL licensed parts in their whole ecosystem. A big part of why we have LLVM is to allow to replace GCC, the GPL licensed compiler, with a permissively licensed compiler, because some of these companies didn't want to rely on a GPL based component. And this is why it's such a difficult topic to make, snappy and quick sound bites about, because this is all so multi-layered, so complex, so many tiny steps leading to bigger steps, many misdirections, many approaches that were tried and given up on, so many failed attempts, so many new roads that we tried to travel. And in hindsight, it's super easy to go back and pretend that there is this big story arc and this storyline that you can illustrate and say, oh, this is how this all made sense, and hey, I knew it in 1991, this was going to be big. And anybody who tells you that is lying to you, because they're making things up retroactively to justify what happened. And in many cases, what happened really feels, even when I look at it today, totally random and pure luck and coincidence. And this is how so much of history is written. It's the million small steps, and we try to make it about one person and one project and one big thing. So to me, the 30-year anniversary for Linux is a big deal. It's wonderful to look back at that. To me, Linus Torvalds as a person has had a huge role in this. But if I look at the bigger picture of that history, it's so many other pieces, so many other projects, so many other people, that sometimes too much focus on this one hero project and this one hero developer kind of hides the complexity that is part of all this, and the complexity that got us here, and the willingness to make mistakes that got us all here.
Dirk, thank you so much for sharing 30 years old. It's a journey, as I said, it has played a very critical role in my own life as well. So even if I'm not a developer, I do feel, kind of being part of the connected and kind of community and connected there. So thanks for sharing that journey. And as usual, I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I love talking about this history. I love reminiscing about where we came from, and I look forward to our next chat. Take care.